UpFront's back, and it's spy chiefs galore. I'll be speaking to the former heads of Israel's Mossad, the Pakistani ISI, and the US Defense Intelligence Agency. I'm Mehdi Hassan. Spies, double games, and shady alliances. Whose side is Pakistan really on when it comes to the so-called war on terror? That's our debate with the former heads of both US and Pakistani military intelligence. But first, earlier this month, one of Israel's top generals referred to revolting trends within Israeli society and drew a comparison between his country and Nazi Germany in the 1930s. And he's not the only senior official to have highlighted Israel's shift to the right. Ephraim Halevi, the former head of Mossad of Israeli intelligence, once said that Jewish extremism was a bigger threat to Israel than a nuclear Iran. He's been an outspoken critic of Prime Minister Netanyahu and says Israel should talk to Hamas. This week's headliner, Ephraim Halevi. Ephraim Halevi, thanks for joining me on UpFront. The Deputy Chief of Staff of the Israeli military, General Yair Golan, said recently that he saw revolting trends in today's Israel in terms of its treatment of minorities that he compared to Nazi Germany in the 1930s. Israel's former defense minister, General Moshe Yaalon, resigned last week, saying extremist and dangerous elements have taken over Israel. What's going on in your country right now?
I think you have to separate rhetoric from the basics and what is really going on. I think there is a lot of soul searching going on. I think that there have been certain manifestations of certain trends which are very, very troublesome. I think both the Deputy Chief of Staff and the resigning Minister of Defense were troubled by what they have seen, what they have heard.
What specifically are you referring to for our viewers?
I'm talking about the fact that there are certain rules of the game in terms of combat, what you do when an enemy has been shot and has been neutralized and can no longer fight, but he's still alive. Are you able to execute him, as apparently was carried out in a certain case? Other aspects in which there have been cases of what we call Jewish terror, which have resulted in the loss of life. Do
you believe that's on the rise? Do you believe that's exponentially changed?
These are things which have not been there before, certainly not in the degree that it is supported by certain sections of the public. That is what is also troublesome, not only the events which took place, but how the public reacted to them.
And politicians and ministers.
And public, yes, and ministers, politicians, and so forth.
You warned that last year's election in Israel was an important election. It would determine maybe even the future of the so-called peace process. Given it produced another victory for Benjamin Netanyahu, who said during the campaign there'd be no Palestinian state on his watch, who then filled his cabinet with right-wing ministers who have publicly, proudly declaimed that they do not believe in a Palestinian state. Is a two-state solution going to happen on Prime Minister Netanyahu's watch while he's Prime Minister?
I doubt it. But I believe the events of the last few days and also the impending appointment of Mr. Lieberman heralds the beginning of the countdown to the end of the administration of Mr. Netanyahu. This is going to be the first shot in a series of events which I believe might come about in the next year or two, which will bring the transition from the Netanyahu era to a different era.
What do you make of Avigdor Lieberman's appointment as the new Israeli defense minister, a man who has called for the reoccupation of Gaza, who has threatened to behead disloyal Palestinian citizens of Israel, who lives on a settlement? If he was a European politician, many would have no qualms about calling him far-right, neo-fascist even in terms of his views, his outlooks, some of his pronouncements about beheadings and other things. Do you think now that the Israeli government, some have called it the most right-wing government in Israel's history? Is that a fair description?
It's a fair description, but I think more than ever before, they will be tested by the way they actually implement policies. When, for instance, there'll be a tension rising on the border with Gaza, and this is just a matter of time. Will this government act differently than the government acted before? I'm not sure, but this will be a test
A lot of Israeli officials say you can't have a two-state solution because on the Palestinian side you have rejectionist groups such as Hamas who want to destroy Israel. They say you've rather boldly broken with that Israeli consensus and said Israel should be talking to Hamas, negotiating with Hamas. Now, if someone like me said that, I'd be accused of being an apologist for Hamas, of being soft on terrorism. But you do say that. You're the former head of Mossad and you say that. Why do you say that? And what's the response to you being inside of Israel on that issue?
First of all, many people have told me in Israel that I'm right, but this is not the time to say it. But there's never a time to say things. I've said this for the last 13, 14 years. You have to talk to your enemies. There are two ways of dialoguing with your enemy. One is to attack them, to behead them, and the other is to talk to them. Next year will mark 30 years for the Hamas being in existence. And the Hamas is still there, although they were beaten from the air and from the ground.
So you're saying accept the reality, political reality of Hamas?
I accept the political reality of Hamas, and I want to say more than that. Despite the fact, for instance, that in the United States it is prohibited to talk to Hamas, many prominent American former officials have been talking to the Hamas over a long period of time.
And you approve of that?
I approve of that.
Is this because in Gaza, where Hamas rules, where Hamas was voted into power almost a decade ago, there have been 3 wars since 2008, 3 occasions on which Israel has bombed Gaza, attacked Hamas, they say. Is that because Israel doesn't really have a political strategy for dealing with Hamas? It only has a military strategy. And many military officials like to, I think the phrase is, mow the lawn in Gaza. They want to go in there every few years, regardless of civilian casualties, regardless of international criticism, and bomb Hamas every few years. Isn't that the truth?
I think it's the truth. And I think that none other than Mr. Netanyahu himself said it after the last conflagration in 2014. He got up and said that the important thing, the important result of what happened after the 50-odd days of confrontation, that the Hamas got nothing. In other words, the success was not what Israel got politically, but the success was that Hamas didn't get anything. This, in my view, certainly bears out the fact that there is no political consideration of Hamas, only treating them as a terrorist group.
But it's more than that, isn't it? Because the international community, the world is told by Israel that every war is started by Hamas, all the wars are the fault of Hamas, all the casualties are the fault of Hamas. It's all Hamas rocket attacks. We hear this from Israeli officials, Israeli journalists, and yet you're accepting that there is an element of the Israeli military and political leadership mowing the lawn, premeditatedly going in to cut Hamas down to size once every couple of years.
Let me tell you something more. Let me let you into a secret.
Okay.
Okay? After all, that was what I was dealing with for many years. If you go now to Israel and you speak to the commanders in the field of the IDF, and I've done it myself, every brigade commander who has been commanding a unit opposite the Gaza Strip believes that the best situation for Israel at this point in time is that the Hamas should be there rather than anybody else. They are there to stay for a long period of time. And if they're there to stay for a long period of time, 2 million people with the highest birth rate in the world, you have to have some political policy and not just a military policy in your hand.
You served as Mossad chief under 3 Israeli prime ministers, Ariel Sharon, Benjamin Netanyahu, Ehud Barak. You served all 3 prime ministers. Which of the 3 prime ministers, Sharon, Netanyahu, Barak, did most damage, do you think, to Israel's reputation, standing, hopes for peace?
I don't want to list that. I think that all Israeli prime ministers in their hearts would like to find some kind of a deus ex machina to do peace.
Although you've called Netanyahu a fearmonger, you've said he's the antithesis of Churchill, you've said he constantly goes on about the Holocaust.
Yes, that I object to, because
so he doesn't sound like a peacemaker or someone who's a kind of responsible. In the United States, he's hailed as a man who they can do business with, who is Hillary Clinton has said she'll invite him to the White House if she's president. You're saying no, he's a fearmonger who goes on about the Holocaust.
I think that he is a fearmonger. I think he uses fear in a way which one should not use. I think nobody should vote out of fear. There's nothing to fear than fear itself, said Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
You admitted at an event in London recently that as head of Mossad, you broke the law, quote, doing the things you were doing. But you wouldn't say what it is you did because you didn't want to spend the rest of your life in prison, you said. People will hear you say that and they'll say, this is why we can't trust intelligence agencies, be it Mossad, the CIA, the ISI. They're all lawless, ultimately. They're rogue. They operate with no regard for the law, and you've basically admitted that.
Let me tell you something. There is no legislation on intelligence. There is no such thing as an orderly way, a legal way, in order to carry out intelligence activities. It's not by chance that one of the oldest professions in life, which is intelligence, has no laws, no codification, no rules of conduct.
You say intelligence has no laws, but there are laws against murder, kidnapping, torture. In your 28 years in Mossad, in your 4 years as Mossad chief, do you regret breaking the law on assassinations, on torture, on kidnappings, which presumably went on while you were in Mossad?
That's your presumption. It's not mine.
Would you deny that there were assassinations conducted by Mossad, kidnappings conducted by Mossad? I mean, Mordecai Vanunu was abducted by Mossad in 1986 while you were in that agency.
I will not take responsibility for any acts which were carried out, and I will not deny any acts.
Okay.
And I don't think that I need to do that. I'll say something else.
But you talked about breaking the law. I'm saying there are laws. You would accept that there are laws against kidnapping, murder and torture? You would accept that as a fact of life?
I accept that there are laws against murder and
kidnapping, torture,
yes,
and Mossad engaged in those activities.
I didn't say Mossad engaged in activities.
But we know Mossad has.
Then you know more than I do about what the Mossad did.
Well, you're not denying it.
I'm not denying it,
Okay,
and I'm not confirming it.
Okay.
I'm not going to say yes or no on what the Mossad has done.
It would be more helpful to your position if you denied it, obviously.
No, I don't want to be helpful on this matter.
Okay. Well,
either
the
to
viewers
you
can
or
make up their
anybody
own
else.
minds.
I don't want to be helpful to anybody.
Okay.
I'm not going to accept something. I'm not going to ascertain that
Would you have
something happened,
any regrets?
and I'm not going to deny it.
Okay, do you have any regrets from your period in Mossad over things that you saw, things you signed off on maybe?
No, I don't have regrets.
Even the laws that you broke?
Except in cases of failure. If I failed in something that I had to do, I regretted that I failed.
Ephraim Halevi, thanks for joining me on UpFront.
Thank you.
To nuke or not to nuke? As Barack Obama prepares to become the first US president to visit Hiroshima, it's worth remembering that the conventional wisdom says dropping the world's first and only atomic bombs was essential for ending the Second World War and saved lives. To this day, a majority of Americans still believe it was the right thing to do, as does one of Japan's top historians, Sadao Asada, who says it's what prompted Japan to surrender. But that's not the whole story. Did you know that a number of leading US military and political figures at the time were hugely critical of President Harry Truman's decision to nuke the Japanese? Admiral William D. Leahy, Truman's chief of staff, said that by using nuclear weapons, the US had adopted an ethical standard common to the barbarians of the Dark Ages. Former US President Herbert Hoover said the use of the atomic bomb with its indiscriminate killing revolts my soul. Ethical debates aside, was the bomb necessary for ending the war? Well, 6 of the 7 5-star US generals and admirals at that time felt there was no need to drop the bomb because Japanese surrender was imminent. General Dwight Eisenhower, later president, said Japan was already defeated and that dropping the bomb was completely unnecessary. And he wasn't alone in his opposition to that. In fact, a post-war panel of 1,000 experts, including surviving Japanese leaders, concluded Japan would have surrendered even if the atomic bombs had not been dropped. Today, more and more historians are questioning the conventional, the traditional arguments in favor of the attack, including the top Japanese historian Toshi Hasagawa, who has, quote, marshaled compelling evidence that it was the Soviet entry into the Pacific conflict, not Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that forced Japan's surrender. And then there's the question, why drop 2 atomic bombs on Japan? As US historian Barton Bernstein put it, whatever one thinks about the necessity of the first A-bomb, the second, dropped on Nagasaki, was almost certainly unnecessary. At least 39,000 people, men, women, children, were instantly incinerated in Nagasaki, at least 60,000 in Hiroshima. Obama might be the first US president to visit Hiroshima since the war's end, but don't expect an apology. It's not really something most US presidents are fond of doing.
I'll never apologize for the United States of America. Ever. I don't care what the facts are.
Well, he may not care, but some of us do, including the victims of the world's first and only nuclear attack. Earlier this month, it was revealed that the CIA once suspected their station chief in Islamabad had been poisoned by Pakistan's military intelligence service, the ISI. Such is the level of distrust between the US and Pakistani governments and their top spies. Now, it's not often, in fact, it's rare that you see the former heads of two countries' intelligence agencies debate sensitive issues like this. But that's exactly what we have in this week's arena. Joining me in the studio is General Michael Flynn, former director of the Defense Intelligence Agency under President Obama, who also helped run US special operations against the Taliban in Afghanistan and is author of a new book on terrorism, The Field of Fight. And from Islamabad, General Asad Durrani, former head of the ISI and one of the main architects of Pakistan's Mujahideen policy in Afghanistan in the 1980s. Gentlemen, thanks for joining me here in the arena. General Flynn, let me start with you. Has the Pakistani ISI, in your view, in your experience, been playing a so-called double game, pretending to support the US in that region, but really supporting the Taliban and its allies?
So in a short answer, I think the answer is yes. I would say that this double game, really what it has to do with is the national security interests of the government of Pakistan have never been aligned as clearly as they need to be with the national security interests of the United States. And I think that the double game really comes down to what I would describe as selfish self-interests of each nation, and we are going to have to figure it out how we develop beyond, two intelligence officers talking about whether or not we're poisoning each other, to much more diplomatic and economic relationships. Because right now we are at such a tactical level with our relationship. It's actually very sad.
General Durrani, it's very sad. General Flynn, the former head of the DIA, says you are playing a double game. Pakistani intelligence, Pakistani government has been, because your interests aren't aligned with America's.
The interests are not aligned with the Americans. That is where I would agree with General Flynn. The two countries are pursuing different objectives. They do not agree as to what approach is to be taken. And I think he's right. National interests determine how the intelligence agencies would cooperate. Once upon a time, since you mentioned about that earlier period, for a certain period, our interests were the same. The CIA's interest in Afghanistan and ours. We wanted to get the Soviets out. We we worked together very well. We respected each other's terms. And the result was that it worked out so very well that the Soviets did leave. Now, the situation is not the same. We do not see eye to eye with each other, and if you must talk about the alliance, I think United States of America and Pakistan were not allies in this particular phase post 9/11 in Afghanistan.
In your view, General Durrani, in places like Afghanistan, are US troops, US intelligence agents, legitimate targets for insurgents? Is that your view?
No, my view is that the US military presence by itself is a source of concern for many people in the region, certainly Pakistan, because the military presence means Afghanistan remains unstable. Some people will keep resisting it and fighting against that. We are neighbors. We are going to be with each other for a long, long time. Long after the United States has gone home, we have to live together. And as I said, in our case, all Afghan factions are important for us, are dear to us.
All Afghan factions are important and dear to us. General Flynn, your new book, the subtitle to your new book is How We Can Win the Global War Against Radical Islam and Its Allies. You served in Afghanistan. At the time, did you believe the ISI was acting as an ally of radical Islam, of quote-unquote jihadi groups?
Yes. They were acting in relationship with groups that were in their interests, groups that were in the Pakistanis' selfish self-interest, as we act with groups in our own U.S. selfish self-interest. And the problem is that it's like a biological virus. It's like a virus that's like Zika. It gets out of control and you can no longer control it. What I have seen, and General Durrani, you can agree or not, what I have seen in the last decade plus is the doubling of the number of groups that we now call radical Islamist groups in Pakistan alone. So the scale
with tacit government or intelligence approval?
It started initially. When we've argued about the Haqqanis and the Taliban relationships with the ISI and others, TTP.
Do you believe those relationships exist?
Absolutely, I believe they
General
exist.
Durrani, why does Pakistan, which is an ally of the US, regardless of interests not being aligned, why is it in a relationship with the Haqqani group, the Taliban, other such groups?
Because the Afghan Taliban are seen by most of the people in the region as a group that is fighting foreign occupation. And that is the source of the sympathy that they have on both sides. A survey by the New York Times said the Afghan Taliban have the support and the sympathy of 1/3 of the population in Afghanistan. That's a good number. You can call the groups that do not like as radical militants and so on and so forth. I am not in the business of calling names. As I said, the regional powers will be foolish not to take them into consideration, not to think about as to what will happen if we also go and target them.
Just sticking on Pakistan, though, you say that it's time to go our separate ways, our interests aren't aligned. Then will you be giving back the $18 billion or so in military aid that the US has given to Pakistan? Isn't it hypocritical to say, we're not aligned with you, but we'll take your money?
You see, I can think of so many reasons why the United States will continue to give that money, or why some people in Pakistan will take that money because of the damage to the infrastructure, because of the damage to the economy. But one thing this money will not achieve, and that money will not force a country like Pakistan to change its national interest, to change its approach to certain problem resolution, will not sell its national policy.
General Flynn?
Yeah. So, I mean, I have enormous respect for General Durrani for his years of service to the world, as much as to his years of service to Pakistan. He said he's not in the business of calling names. I'm in the business of defining threats, clearly defining the threats that we face. We do have some commonalities. We do have some similarities in the threats that we face. And we are looking at some real serious issues if we allow the situation in Afghanistan to continue to go in the direction that it's in. And frankly, Pakistan has been playing a very funny game, you know, and you have to decide whose side are you on at the end of the day. And I just think that Pakistan has had a tough time deciding whose side they're on.
General Durrani.
You see, double game has been talked about so many times, and I'm just tempted to repeat whatever one has been saying so often. The countries do not play single games. They have to keep so many balls in the air. But I think General Flynn is right about defining the threat. So what is the threat that we define in Afghanistan? It's the instability.
What about the threat in Pakistan? You have the TTP, the Pakistani Taliban. You now have ISIL.
I'm so glad this question is being asked about TTP. TTP emerged when Pakistan very foolishly started taking military action in its own tribal area because of either the pressure or because of the bidding of the United States. TTP is the product of the war next door that started after 9/11.
The TTP, the Pakistani Taliban, General Flynn, says General Durrani is all the fault of the US occupation next door.
Yeah, it's not. It's not. He knows this. I mean, again, the problems reside and exist right inside of Pakistan. I'm more concerned about Pakistan collapsing than I am about Afghanistan. Pakistan collapses, we have a significant problem, and there are about 5 times as many people in Pakistan.
General Durrani?
It's very heartwarming when people are concerned about Pakistan and its future. The problem is that when they ask us to go and target such groups like the Haqqanis, who do not act against Pakistan, then they are asking us to create even more enemies. There are enough number of threats that Pakistan faces, western border, eastern border, and within. We have no intentions of increasing the number of enemies.
There's a lot of Afghans, I'm sure, who'd be watching this, who might say a plague on both your houses.
Yeah.
US intelligence and Pakistani intelligence both sponsored a lot of nasty, unsavory groups in that country over the years, foreign fighters included, that have wrecked ordinary Afghan people's lives. What would you say to them?
Well, I mean, personally, I would say that what we have to do, continue to do for that entire region is we have to reinstill confidence that we actually can help them. I mean, just in a very generic, very strategic way, we cannot leave this region to the likes of these multiple terrorist organizations.
Some of which you've sponsored in the past. You would accept that?
And I think we have been enabling them collectively. The two of us here in our own, in our own worlds, they have been enabled to a degree. And I think that we have to tell the people of the region, not just Afghanistan, that we are not going to back out of there and just suddenly pull the plug, because there's too much at stake.
Gentlemen, thank you for your time. We'll have to leave it there. Thanks both for joining me in the arena. That's our show. Up Front will be back next week.